Welcome Mzansi, you are listening to Farmers Inside Track, proudly brought to you by Food for Mzansi. I'm your host, Dawn Mdu. Officially, this is the world's best podcast for 2024 as awarded by WAN-EFRA, the global organization for the world's press. In this edition, we evaluate the effect of pasture rotation on tick-borne disease prevalence in cattle. Our experts, Kenneth Malatji, an experienced animal health technician, and Dr Caryn Shacklock, a laboratory manager, joins us to share how rotating pastures and alternative grazing systems affect the prevalence of tick-borne diseases in livestock. Welcome, Dr Caryn Shacklock and Kenneth Malatji.
Hello, Dawn. Thanks for having me today.
Hi, Dawn. Thank you so much for hosting us here.
Now, obviously, I mentioned the introductory, just comments on what we'll be talking about. So as I started, I mentioned what we'll be talking about, and we'll specifically be investigating, how rotating pastures and alternative grazing systems affects the prevalence of tick-borne diseases when it comes to livestock and the implications thereof. And I'm going to pose the first question to you, Kenneth. Can you explain how pasture rotation works and how it can impact tick populations in grazing systems?
So pasture rotation, or it can also be called rotational grazing, is a sustainable farming method that involves strategical moving of livestock between designated camps to allow vegetation or grass to recover and rejuvenate. So this approach, it fosters the healthy and more productive ecosystem. So through rotational grazing, farmers can enjoy various benefits, which include environmental outcome, enhanced animal well-being, and increased farming activity. So some of the things, the advantages, and particularly in managing tick population, the key steps can be dividing land into camps. So the grazing area is divided into smaller section or camps. So you can also schedule grazing. So livestock are rotated through these camps according to the planned schedule, giving each area time to rest and recover. So it can also be a monitoring grass health. So farmers can also monitor the health of the grass, checking how the grass look like, moving the livestock based on the growth and the recovery of the grass. The impact of tick population, I'll just mention two. Maybe if Dr. Shacklock has more, she can jump in. By moving livestock away from heavy infested areas, rotational grazing disrupts the life cycles of the ticks. And we know the ticks require hosts to feed and reproduce. So by reducing the time livestock spend in one area, the farmer limits that opportunity for the ticks, the opportunity to attach and breed. Dr. Shacklock, do you have anything to add on?
Thanks, Kenneth. So it's important to understand the different life cycles of the ticks that we have in South Africa. Certain ticks are multi-host ticks, which means that they climb onto the host, they feed, and then they drop off the host to move to the next stage of its life cycle. And so from larvae to nymph or nymph to adult, and in between, they then climb back onto the host to feed and drop off again. And they don't necessarily get onto the cattle host. Some tick species have intermediate hosts, which are other animal species. One of our biggest challenges in South Africa is a single host tick. So our blue ticks, Rhipicephalus microplus and Rhipicephalus decoloratus, that spend their entire life cycle on our cattle. And all the life cycle stages and the molting happens on the animal. So those are the ticks that we are challenged to control because those ticks are developing resistance to our acaricide dips. And so rotational grazing is one of the strategies that we can look at to help us control those single host ticks. And there is some research that suggests that a certain period of time without a host in a camp can definitely reduce the number of ticks that climb onto the animal when animals are reintroduced into the camp.
Just to jump in, Dawn, because I work more on communal farmers. So rotational grazing, when it comes to communal farmers, is a bit difficult to do, but because of the limited land coordination where you need to speak to many people to agree on one and again infrastructure. But overall, when effectively implemented, the rotational grazing can significantly impact the tick population and it can improve the health and productivity of livestock in communal areas.
Thank you so much for that context. I think it's important to kind of get a scope of farmers in different regions, communal farmers, smallholder farmers, if they have their own land or if they're farming on communal land. And then obviously bigger, large-scale commercial farmers. And thank you so much just for giving us some of that context and sharing some of your experience on the ground working with farmers. Kenneth, how does pasture rotation specifically affect the prevalence of tick-borne diseases? And I think you just touched on it specifically, but if we can talk about anaplasmosis in cattle, and if you can also just talk about alternative grazing systems and approaches that farmers can kind of start implementing to reduce the risk of these tick-borne diseases. I'm going to kick off with Dr. Shacklock.
We are challenged with a number of tick-borne diseases in South Africa, most significantly redwater, hardwater, and anaplasmosis, as you mentioned. So in order for a tick-borne disease to be transmitted to an animal, the tick actually has to bite the animal. So if we can minimize the number of ticks that actually climb onto the host animal in the first place, we stand a better chance at controlling these tick-borne diseases. So pasture rotation is one of those tools that we can use to reduce the load of larvae. If we're talking about the single host ticks, we reduce the load of those larvae on the pasture so that when we introduce cattle or sheep into the camp, there are fewer ticks that can actually climb onto our livestock animals. If we talk about anaplasmosis specifically, it's transmitted by our single host ticks that I mentioned earlier, the blue ticks. It's also transmitted by one of our multi-host ticks, the red-legged ticks. So we need to consider that in our tick control strategy. So when an engorged female tick drops off the host and she lays her eggs, those eggs need about 42 days to hatch. And then the larvae are best fit and ready to climb onto a host 3 to 8 days after hatching. We need to leave a camp free for 45 days. Then the larvae have sort of gone past the stage where they're strongest and most able to climb onto a host. They're quite weak and they don't do well without a host about a week after hatching. So if we can leave a camp free for 45 days, 45 to 50 days, free of grazing animals, then we have fewer viable larvae that can climb onto our animals and transmit diseases. It's quite a big ask in South Africa, but yeah, that's the research out there.
Kenneth was laughing at that, definitely agreeing with you there, Dr. Shacklock. What would you like to add, Kenneth? Thanks.
No, I think she said a lot. I'm also leaning from this one. I'm leaning from her because she's specialist when it comes to ticks. So what I can say is pasture rotation is an effective practice which is very significant in reducing the prevalence of ticks against the disease that she mentioned. And when you disrupt the life cycles of this of ticks population, so you're promoting pasture health, minimizing cattle exposure on ticks transmission, implementing these practices along with other management strategies, create more resilient grazing system and enhance overall health.
Thank you so much for that context. And of course, it doesn't work. You're not working in silos. There's a lot more to it. So kind of managing all of this collectively with different practices on farm level. When it comes to what role does vegetation management play, specifically in controlling tick habitats within pasture rotation systems? I think we've touched on this throughout the discussion already, but if you could just give us some context to that. Dr. Shacklock, I'll start with you.
Ticks like vegetation. They need a long blade of grass to climb up to be able to attach to a host. They like dense, warm, moist vegetation depending on the species of tick. So if we can keep our grazing short and under control and not let it get moribund, not let it overgrow and become thick and dense, that certainly helps. If our animals are grazing in sort of bushveld and there's a lot of shrubs around, certain tick species really like that. That helps them, again, climb up and attach onto a host. Another thing to consider is to graze non-target hosts in the camp before we put our other livestock species in there. So it's not a bad idea to graze cattle and sheep together, depending on what the challenge in that area is. And different livestock species graze differently. So if you want to bring sheep into a camp, they like their grass relatively short, you can put your cattle in before you introduce the sheep into that camp. And then that also helps keep the tick burden down because it keeps the foliage and the vegetation short and under control.
How does the climate and seasonality influence the effectiveness of pasture rotation in reducing tick-borne disease transmission?
Ticks are quite seasonal. They like warm, wet weather. So in most of South Africa, our ticks are most prevalent in spring, summer, early autumn, and we get a bit of a reprieve from the tick burden in wintertime when it's quite cold and when there's been frost. That's something that we need to bear in mind, that the tick load on the pastures in the vegetation is a lot heavier during our warm, wet months. But there is a tick species that we need to be aware of, the Karoo paralysis tick, that is most prevalent in autumn. It likes the southern slopes of hills in the Karoo. We need to be mindful of not sending sheep and goats into those south-facing camps in autumn and wintertime because the Karoo paralysis tick is most prevalent then. A strategy that we can implement is to send cattle into those camps first, or to not graze sheep and goats in those camps during autumn and winter, and to use other available grazing in those months and then introduce the sheep into those camps during summer. So seasonality plays a big role. Another thing to think about is that if larvae have been lying dormant in the pastures over winter, they can survive and be dormant. Then we get this lovely spring rain and warm weather like we're having at the moment. And then we get what we call a spring rise. So suddenly we've got a heavy load of tick larvae on our pastures and we're not ready for them. We don't see them on the cattle yet, but they're there. So farmers need to be a bit more strategic about how they graze their animals during that time. Maybe don't introduce them to the camps where there is thick, dense, moist vegetation without the protection of an acaricide dip, perhaps.
Maybe we could just focus on, significant studies or data on the long-term impact of pasture rotation on the health of cattle herds. Thank you so much, Dr. Caryn.
So Kenneth has mentioned that pasture rotation is a very useful tool in managing grazing, ensuring the best health of the soil and the grass, and that obviously has an impact on the health of our cattle. From a tick control point of view, it is just one of the tools that we can use in an integrated tick control strategy and has been shown to help. There's not a lot of studies out there on how rotational grazing impacts tick control specifically. There are a couple, but it's definitely a tool to livestock health in the long term because it helps pasture and soil health. Kenneth, if you want to add anything there, go for it.
Just to add on, there's some research has shown that pasture rotation can lead to better forage quality and availability. So this results in improved nutrition for cattle, which can enhance the growth rate, reproduction performances, and overall health. So I haven't found much studies or research on the implications that the rotational grazing has on ticks.
Thanks so much. Kenneth, maybe I could keep you here and just talk about some of the challenges or limitations that farmers may face when kind of implementing pasture rotation for disease control. As someone that works quite hands-on with farmers, what are some of the challenges that they do face on the ground?
Yeah, working with mostly communal farmers, the challenges that we get is that the rotational grazing, it's challenging to practice because of all the communities are grazing their cattle at one place. And the challenge of land. So the land is not directly proportional to the number of animals that are grazing in that land. So it's a very huge challenge to try to manage the grazing there. So that's why we are faced with overgrazing at most times. And with the cases that we are attending now, there's more animals that are lying down because of not getting proper grazing. So that's the challenge that we're facing at the current moment. With the delayed rain, so I think we'll have more of those challenges up until maybe November, getting into December. Hopefully we get rain soon.
Thank you so much for that, Kenneth, sharing some of that information. Now, Dr. Shacklock, maybe you can talk about, can pasture rotation be used in conjunction with other methods, vaccinations, for better control of tick-borne diseases in livestock overall?
Tick control really needs to be a integrated management practice. We can't rely on just one tool to control ticks in South Africa. There's a lot of research that tells us that ticks are becoming more and more resistant to acaricides, to the dips that we use to control ticks. So chemical control cannot be used on its own. So we have to look at all the tools we have at our disposal and put together an integrated management system. This includes things like pasture rotation, vaccination against the tick-borne diseases. There are some vaccines against ticks that are in the pipeline, which is very exciting. We can look at alternative control methods that are not chemical. There's a lot of research going on to acaricidal fungi, lots of interesting things there. So an integrated approach is really important. As far as pasture management goes, there is burning as an option. Burning a pasture definitely reduces the number of ticks available on that pasture, but burning comes with its own set of restrictions and complications. It has definitely a environmental impact and can lead to erosion, but it is also one of the tools that we can use to control ticks in a pasture.
The integrated methods is definitely something that farmers should always understand. There's not one, solution to it. And I think that's something to always be mindful of What are the economic implications for farmers adopting pasture rotation in terms of both the cost and potential benefits related to disease prevention? How do they actually save costs?
Adopting pasture rotation can have significant economic implications for farmers, both on cost and potential benefits related to disease prevention. So some of the costs can include initial setup of costs, so infrastructure. Farmers may need to invest in fencing, water sources, other infrastructures to facilitate the pasture rotation. So it can be equipment. They might need the equipment to have a successful rotation. Then it can also be labor costs, increased labor. Now when you are introducing other camps, so you might need labor, and also planning and managing the rotations and training. So you might need to train the farmers or the animal handlers. You might need to invest time in there to train them how this thing works for monitoring and everything. Those are the things that I can think of.
As Kenneth already mentioned, pasture rotation does hold a lot of benefits for the quality of the feed that is generated in that pasture and the quality of the soil in the long term. So if a farmer can afford to invest in fencing, water points, possibly shelter, and can accommodate the higher stocking density that he will need to implement to leave part of his farm without cattle grazing for a certain period of time, then there is definitely a benefit to rotational grazing in terms of the quality of the feed that's produced on the pasture and parasite control.
And then my last question is just around, are there any particular breeds of cattle or livestock that respond better to pasture rotation when it comes to reducing tick-borne disease prevalence?
Yes, certain breeds of cattle and other livestock may respond better to pasture rotation in terms of reducing tick-borne diseases and prevalence. Here are some factors and breeds that might be more advantageous. So factors factors influencing response, it might be one, resistant to ticks. So some breeds have shown a greater natural resistance to tick infestation due to genetic factors or skin characteristics. Another point I can say, grazing behavior. So livestock can exhibit different grazing behavior and may have different levels of exposure to ticks. For instance, breeds that are more mobile might help disrupt the tick life cycle.
Thanks so much, Dr. Shacklock.
Just some interesting research on breeds of cattle that are more resistant to ticks than others. And a lot of our indigenous cattle breeds in South Africa are inherently resistant to ticks. So for every 100 ticks that comes on a resistant animal, only 1 out of 100 will go on to produce viable offspring. So we're actually reducing the load of ticks on our pastures by grazing more resistant cattle and breeding for resistance, being selective in how we choose which animals to breed with. We're actually reducing the number of ticks on our pastures in the long run, which is really the goal when it comes to control of ticks and tick-borne diseases. So let's not underestimate selectively breeding for tick resistance.
We've come to the end of the discussion. I think there's a lot more to obviously understand and be said around the topic, but if you have any final comments that you can share for farmers to kind of latch onto, any other resource material that they could possibly go to find more information, where would that be? I'm going to start with you, Kenneth.
Just to encourage our farmers to say we can practice rotational grazing, even though it might be difficult, but if we can come together as communities or villages, then we dedicate or we designate an area that need to be fenced, because now with the seasons mostly changing and we don't get enough rain as we used to. So it is a bit difficult for farmers. They don't have any alternative place to put their animals for grazing. So I would say this is the way to go. We should look at this and how possible the farmers can. I think with farmers having these associations and everything, I think if they can come together, I think this can be possible if we work together.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. Any last comments from you, Dr. Caryn?
Yes, just in terms of tick control, just for our farmers to be mindful that there is no one solution to this overwhelming problem that we face in South Africa, and that really we need to look at an integrated management strategy when it comes to controlling ticks and tick-borne diseases. We can't rely on dips only. So we need to look at alternatives and cooperative solutions, and rotational grazing is an option. This is one of those tools that we can use. For resources on tick control and animal health input, AfriVet has a lot of resources that farmers can reach out to us for. And also remember that local state vet officers have animal health technicians and state veterinarians who are also available to offer support. If you have a look at our website, there are resources available to assist as well.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, AfriVet, we do trainings. So if farmers need training about all these topics and everything, that we can chip in and be involved in the training.
Thanks so much for your insights, Kenneth Malatji, an experienced animal health technician, and Dr. Caryn Shacklock, a laboratory manager. For more updates on optimizing your agricultural practices, visit www.foodformzansi.co.za. Remember, you can subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with fellow agriculture enthusiasts. From me, Donumdu, our technical producer Megan van der Vent, and the rest of the hashtag Team Food from Zanzi, until next time, happy farming.